So for this Christmas, my family and I, including some family friends and their son, who is a good friend of mine, went to stay at a hotel near a ski center because we wanted to see snow after 2 good years of not seeing snow, since we live in Greece, and it's pretty much extremely hot through the whole year. Now when we arrived, we were told by our parents that me and my friend were going to stay at a hotel, and our parents were all going to stay together in a house a few minutes away from where the hotel was. This didn't quite seem to bother us, as we felt more free and quite. Also, there was no other rooms for us left in the house with our parents. So everything was normal. We checked in the hotel, received our keys for our room. The whole place was pretty small, and it had 3 entrances, one being to the cafeteria, which was a big door which was pretty much locked the whole time, and was only opened by the staff during the morning in order for people staying at the hotel to have breakfast there. There was another entrance, which was the main entrance, and the doors were never locked, despite at night. And lastly, there was a little back door, which was pretty much open the whole time, and had a direct entrance to all the rooms that the guests stayed at. I'll have to mention that you couldn't really lock the door of your room either, because the doorknobs were messed up, so even if you had locked the door with a key, if someone used enough force and pushed into it enough, they could still open it. We stayed at room number 3, which was at the first floor and was just one of those rooms I'm really sorry had a small hallway. Now, the first 2 nights sleeping there didn't feel exactly comfortable, as of course we weren't sleeping in our own homes, so we had to kind of adapt to the place. But overall, the hotel was pretty okay, and we didn't really feel unsafe since there were other people sleeping there too, and our parents' house was only like 5 minutes away. However, during the 3rd night, I couldn't really sleep, and at about 5 in the morning, I felt pretty uncomfortable, as I had a gut feeling that something was there in the room with me and my friend. I had to act like kind of the big brother to him in that moment. Therefore, I took my phone and turned on the flashlight, and as I looked around the room, I didn't notice anything at first, so I just went to the bathroom and did a real quick check-in, and when I came out, I noticed 2 things. The first thing I noticed was that my friend had woken up, and he'd seemed kind of anxious, at which point he told me that he couldn't sleep. The second, well, there were some little mistletoe twigs spread around the room. Now, I have noticed from the first day that the staff of the hotel had to hang mistletoe on the doorknobs of every room because it was Christmas, but I had never noticed our room being such a mess from the mistletoe before. Despite one time where I had forced the doorknob open because my friend was sleeping inside the room, and I had left the keys inside, so I couldn't get in normally. That kind of shook me at first, but I tried to remain calm, and I just opened up the lights and started to talk to my friend about why he was feeling so anxious and at unease. He told me that he just couldn't sleep, and then he asked me something that creeps me out to this day. He asked me if I stood up at the middle of the night and just looked down at him for a good 5 seconds before exiting the room for whatever reason so late. I didn't want to cause him any panic, so I just said that sure, I did that. I sometimes sleepwalk, even though I knew that was not me. Eventually, we both calmed down and got back to sleep, but not before putting a chair close to the door. It was in that chair that I sat on my phone till the next day, just so my friend could get some sleep, as he was pretty paranoid about the whole ordeal. I never mentioned anything because I didn't want to cause anyone to panic, and because this, it could have just really been a very unfortunate combination of events. Also, we were scheduled to leave that morning either way, so I just held all this inside myself and didn't tell anyone. But who knows what could have happened if when I opened my phone's flashlight, someone was actually there. I'm a 25-year-old female living in a small town in Idaho. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal. Obsessed might be a better word. Despite my fascination, I've only encountered a few instances in person, and the following recollection is one of my favorites to tell. The store in which this happened and the names of the co-workers involved will be kept anonymous, even though the store has been closed, for no other reason than to protect the company which I no longer work for. At the time this story took place, I was 20. Me and my boyfriend had just moved to Twin Falls, Idaho for a career opportunity. I had landed a management job doing signage and shipment for a retail store that happened to be located right along the canyon's edge. We packed up what little we had and moved with very little notice to a place we had never been. We found a small, very run-down apartment in a not-so-nice part of town. It was all we could afford at the time, and I had truly thought I would make it big here. This new job was our ticket to a better life. It was December, very close to Christmas time, although I can't remember the exact day. The holidays are a very rough time for retail workers, as the business picks up immensely. Due to this, so do the hours of operation. On this particular night, we were open until midnight, and I was tasked with the closing shift. I remember feeling this was very unfair, because I would be the one opening at 7 a.m. the next morning. The way the closing shift worked, we would have 4 people scheduled from 2 to 10, then 2 people scheduled from 6 p.m. to 1 in the morning. We would adjust this as needed, but it was a Tuesday, and half of the night shift had already been sent home due to the slow business. So, when I arrived, only 2 people were in the store. The night manager, let's call her Jess, and my closing cashier, we'll call her Kim. I'd only been working there for a few months, and I had somehow managed to get on the night manager's bad side. Looking back, I'm sure I wasn't the easiest person to get along with, as I took my job very seriously, and the others really didn't. Jess had been working there for a very long time, and clearly disliked me. She was known for being a bit of a prankster. She had made it her life's mission to be a nuisance to myself and the other employees. She would be hiding behind corners, in dressing rooms, and anywhere she could stay out of sight in order to scare someone. I, however, was not easily scared. I'm horribly anxious all the time and constantly on guard. Besides, I could usually hear her snickering from across the hall. This infuriated her. It was as if her scaring me was her personal responsibility. All of this is important to the events that would follow. She was more than eager to leave the moment I stepped in the store. She grabbed her things, clocked out, and left at 10 without saying more than a brief greeting/goodbye. I was fine with this, as conversations with her were like pulling teeth. The store was quiet for the entire evening. No more than a few customers stopped in, and the night felt like it was dragging on. That was, until it was time to close. As soon as the clock hit midnight, I did my nightly check, walking from the back of the store, through each dressing room, the bathrooms, the employee area, around each department, and up to the registers, checking to make sure there was no one left. I conducted this walk every night, and I did this thoroughly. The point of this check was to make absolutely certain no one had been still in the store. Once I made it to the register, I informed my cashier, Kim, that we would get out early as I had to work again in the morning. She agreed, put in one headphone, turned off the horrible Christmas music everyone hated, and began to sweep up. I grabbed her till tray and the only one left open, and proceeded to the back of the office to count down and finish the paperwork. As I made my way back, I glanced over each department one more time to check for customers. Looking back, I don't know why I did this. I usually don't. I trust my checks, but that night I felt like someone was still in there. This bothered me to the point I did my check again, just to be certain. I didn't see anyone and returned to the office. This store was a fairly big size, warehouse-style building with concrete floors and tall rafters in the center of the shopping complex. Being here after close always gave me a weird vibe, but especially tonight. I summed it up to the falling snow outside, sleep deprivation, and working long hours. However, I would never mistrust this gut feeling again. Every employee was required to wear a clip-on walkie-talkie with a wired headset. This was the main way we would communicate with each other. These headsets were known to pick up interference and act up on a regular basis, and tonight would not be any different. I was typing up some numbers, completely focused in on what I was working on, mostly just rushing to get out as soon as I can. The headset crackled to life, sending a loud mesh of static voices into my right ear. The static was loud enough to make me jump, almost completely out of my seat. I muttered curses under my breath and turned the volume all the way down. As soon as I resumed my work, I noticed the familiar sound of jingle bells ringing from outside the office. I rolled my chair back and leaned backwards out the door. The music had been turned back on, merely and rather loudly playing jingle bells. I picked up my headpiece and called out for Kim. She answered in a confused tone, asking why I turned on the music. The controller for the music was up at the front registers, and I had no way of turning it on from where I was. What? I didn't touch the music. You're the only one up there. Why did you turn it on? I asked, rather annoyed. Kim had always minded her own business. She wasn't well liked among the other crew either, and stayed out of Jess's little vendetta against me. All this intermingled drama was quite common for a business full of girls. Her silence at my question was even more irritating, but I watched on the store cameras as she quickly turned the store music off. We both continued with our work. Less than 3 minutes passed, and the walkie crackled to life again. I looked back at the cameras, a symphony of static to my ear. This time, a familiar voice broke through. "Can you hear me? Please?" Static overtook the voice. Walkie, home." The words broke through the static in between. It was common to hear static over the walkies, but never voices like that. I pressed the small button on the headset. "Jess?" I knew that voice anywhere. She sounded almost panicked. "What? No one else is here. It's just us." Her silence at my question was even more irritating, but I watched on the store cameras as she quickly turned the store music off. We both continued with our work. Less than 3 minutes passed, and the walkie crackled to life again. I looked back at the cameras, a symphony of static to my ear. This time, a familiar voice broke through. "Can you hear me? Please?" Static overtook the voice. Walkie, home." The words broke through the static in between. It was common to hear static over the walkies, but never voices like that. I pressed the small button on the headset. "Jess?" I knew that voice anywhere. She sounded almost panicked. "What? No one else is here. It's just us." Kim's voice clear as day through the headset. No static. "Didn't you hear that?" I asked, watching Kim move slowly over to the center of the store on the camera. "No, I didn't hear anything." She looked visibly confused on the camera, spinning around searching each department. The walkie crackled yet again. "Please? Is anyone there?" This was much louder and more clear. There was no way Kim wasn't hearing this. She resumed her work as I watched her closely. She hadn't taken a side on the drama in the store, but that didn't mean she wasn't going to. I grinned at the camera. "Well played, Jess." I almost laughed out loud. This woman would stop at nothing to spook me, but staying 3 hours past her shift to make it happen, that seemed like a stretch. But if she wanted to scare me that badly, I suppose this was a good time to do so. I calmly stood up from my chair, stretched, and grabbed my bottle of water off the counter. If she did, in fact, try to jump out at me when I found her, she was going to get a face full of water. My mind was racing with where she could be hiding. I was almost certain that I had checked every nook and cranny when I did my walk, but maybe she had left and managed to sneak back in using her store key. These racing thoughts stopped instantly as I made my way out of the office. The table that held the charging ports for the walkie-talkies was right outside the office. Glancing at the receiver, I noticed only 2 walkies were missing. Mine and Kim's. We didn't have any extras. 6 in total, and 4 sat charging. The lights all flashing green, indicating they were fully charged. The overactive imagination began running scenarios through my head as I made another walk through the store, searching every room, every corner, the bathrooms, the rafters, even under displays and between racks, everywhere. I took a peek outside the front doors. A thick blanket of snow had fallen over the dim parking lot, and the only 2 cars in the entire stretch of the canyon were ours. No footprints in the snow, as we hadn't had a customer almost all night. I shook my head and went back to the office. I summoned the noise up as interference and began closing out the day. It was almost 1 a.m. and I wanted to go home. I closed the door and turned back to my paperwork, but not before suddenly getting the strong urge to look at the front camera. Something caught my eye. There, standing next to the register, was Kim, perfectly standing still. her head turned towards the front corner of the store by the main entrance. She stood so still for a moment, I thought the security system had crashed. I watched the window scene for a moment and caught the steady snow falling out the front window. She held a broom in one hand and held completely still. Suddenly, she dropped the broom, spun on her heels, and began sprinting toward the back office. This girl was by no means fit. I had never seen her move faster than a brisk walk, but she was sprinting, leaning forward, her headphones bouncing wildly behind her. I shot up from my seat and opened the office door for her. She sped right past me, almost ran into the counter, spun around, and slammed the door behind us. Completely out of breath, I stared her up and down. What the hell is wrong with you? My heart felt like it was pounding as hard as hers. She was white in the face, and her eyes were tearing up. There's someone up there. There's a man in the store. Her voice was very high-pitched, and she was almost choking on her own breath. Her eyes were wide, and there was not a hint of humor in them. I leaned forward, glaring at her. This girl was terrified. This wasn't a prank. At least if it was, Kim was not in on it. She was legitimately afraid. At this point, all my alarm bells started going off. Twin Falls was hardly a safe town, as I had decided to move there at a rough time where drug problems and homelessness seemed to be an all-time high, even for such a small town. I rolled around to search the cameras. Fight or flight mode had officially been activated, and my main priority now was to keep my employees safe. I began switching through channels. There was nothing on the cameras. Kim stayed her breath and pointed to the front doors, slightly to the left. That's where I saw him. A tall man, I think, in a black trench coat. The coat almost touches the floor. I kept looking. Nothing. Sifting through each channel over and over. And he's wearing like a top hat. I stopped. Suddenly, I was frozen, staring at my hand on the mouse. A top hat? I turned back to look at her. She was visibly shaking and crying. I'm not seeing him, I said, looking her over and over. She shook her head. I don't think you can see him on those. I nodded. The only way out without setting the fire alarms off was through those doors. If there was someone in the store, he would certainly see us leaving. But I hadn't seen anyone. Something wasn't right for certain. But if it was just someone playing a prank, and I called the police, I would certainly get in trouble. On the other hand, if there was actually someone here with ill intentions, and I didn't call the police, I would get in more trouble. I was completely at a loss on what to do. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Hard, heavy footsteps outside the office door. Impossible, I thought. We hadn't seen anyone on the camera coming this way. There was no way for him to be back here without us noticing. I suddenly felt dizzy, nauseous, and out of breath. My hands started shaking, and my knees felt weak. I had felt this before. Sudden, imminent, and certain danger. I had to get us out of this building. It wasn't until this point that I realized this wasn't something I could just rationalize. This was beyond explanation, but explanation didn't matter. Not right now. Right now we need to run. It didn't even cross my mind to lock the door and call the police. For some reason, that didn't seem to make sense at the time. This thing, whatever it was at the back of the building now, which means our best bet was to run out the front. I grabbed Kim's coat and threw it at her. We have to make a run for it. She nodded and put on her coat, grabbed her purse and nodded at me. I grabbed my keys, leaving my coat and backpack completely, and grasped the handle. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but at this point I think I was acting purely on instinct and intuition, as nothing about my actions makes sense to my rational mind now. I ripped open the door and we ran. I'll admit I didn't even look back. I could feel it. I knew something or someone was there. I could feel its eyes on me. It felt like the back of my neck was on fire. We ran. I could have easily outran Kim, but I stayed a few steps behind her, making sure she got out first. She hit the front doors hard. She unlocked them quickly and was out of the store faster than I ever seen anyone move. She was at her car in no time and was getting in sobbing. I, however, had stopped just outside the front doors. I stood in the snow and cool, silent night air and watched as she tore out of the parking lot like a bat out of hell. I couldn't move. I stood there for what felt like hours collecting my breath and turned slowly to face the building, the light still shining brightly out of the full face of windows. I couldn't leave the store like that. I was terrified beyond belief. My hands and knees were shaking, but I could not leave the store. Lights on, unlocked, alarm unarmed, all night. So, full of fear of losing my job and fear of what was in that building, I went back in. The store was completely silent. There was no movement, no shuffling, no footsteps, nothing. Even the heavy feeling of danger I had felt so strongly before was completely gone. I slid sideways over to the alarm system. I punched in my code and hit arm. The system beeped and I didn't arm. I stiffened and turned to face the system. Motion error, section 5. I urgently typed my code again and hit arm. Motion error, section 4. The alarm system wouldn't arm if it detected motion in the building. This way, it wouldn't be able to be set during business hours or when employees were still in the building. The only way it would set was if there was only motion in section 1, the front of the store. After it was set, employees would have 30 seconds to get out of the building before it would actually set for the night. This was telling me there was motion in the back of the store, heading up to the front. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry and yell and tell this thing to fuck off and leave me the hell alone. I was tired. I was afraid, and I was angry. I punched in my code, hit system override, armed the building, turned off the lights, and ran out of that store. I slammed the locked doors behind me and stepped back into the snow. Everything was silent again, calm and silent. I stared at those doors for what seemed like another hour before finally turning around and going home for the night. I had hoped to see someone. I hoped this man would pop out and try to leave the building, setting off the alarm, but nothing moved in that store. Not while I was watching it, at least. I went home that night, crawled into bed, and cried in my boyfriend's arms until I finally fell asleep as the sun rose. Of course, I had to go back the next morning. I felt almost hungover as I dragged myself through the snow to the front doors of that awful place, really debating if I needed this job. To my surprise, I wasn't the first person to show up. As I arrived, my general manager stood shivering in the snow in the front of the building with a police officer. My heart dropped. The lock had been broken off the doors from the inside and had tripped the alarm. The police had arrived, finding nothing in the store. Nothing stolen and no footprints in the snow. The alarm company had woken my boss and told her the alarm had been tripped, and she arrived at the store at the same time as the officer. Her expression was of pure rage. "What the hell happened last night?" I had hoped nothing would be amiss and I wouldn't have to tell her. With a big sigh, I explained to her and the officer that we experienced last night. They of course didn't believe a word of it. The policeman left, assuming the doors had been broken by wind or something of that like, and simply asked for security footage if we chose to send it. I was taken to the office to review camera footage. My boss sat in silence as she reviewed my whole night, only commenting on the fact I didn't finish my paperwork. The cameras showed nothing, only Kim and I running around like lunatics. It was after I left that anything tangible showed up. It was the front doors, clearly locked and armed, swinging open at 3 a.m. effortlessly, and the locks dropping off them as if they had not been fastened to the doors at all. Jess arrived shortly after, obviously to take over my shift as I was being sent home. When asked about the incident, she of course knew nothing, and swore she had gone straight home without ever touching the walkie-talkies. My only other hope for redemption would be Kim's story. I hadn't experienced this alone, and I knew she would back me up. The problem was, Kim never returned to work. She never showed up for her shift, she never answered another phone call, she never came to pick up her last check. Last I heard of her was through another coworker, who simply said she'd suddenly moved back in with her parents in Arizona. I put in my 2 weeks that night. We moved back home to where we felt the most comfortable, and 7 months later that store closed permanently for cost-related reasons. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and on everything I hold dear, I swear it's true. I simply wish I had the evidence to back it up. This is the story of my uncle breaking into my family's house on Christmas Eve. To get the key details in place, I was in my early 20s and I'm 6 foot flat, 200 pounds, and as broad as a brick house. This comes into play later. Now my family, just like anyone else's, has its share of dysfunctional members. This one just seems to have an overwhelming amount. Sadly, my dad is the only one that left that type of life behind him and was able to make something of himself from an abusive, toxic environment that made everyone else that way. It also made him the lightning rod for emotional drama. This is what brought this about. My uncles are or were all addicts at some point in their life. Some turned around, and some still ride that white horse. One of my uncles on the White Pony Express decided that doing coke and chasing it down with booze isn't the best course for a 45-year-old with a kid that never sees him. He tried to reach out to my grandmother to get off the wagon, but she couldn't be bothered to talk to him down off the ledge and shoved him off on my dad. He was looking for a way out, and my dad did what he could do to help find him a new one, because that's what family does. They talk for months, off and on, and so on and so forth. My dad keeps on doing what he can. However, he remains cautious because he knows addicts are not the most upfront people. But months pass and my uncle improves. He goes 6 months sober, reconnects with his son a little, actually gives sobriety a solid shot, the whole 9 yards. November rolls around, and it's month 7 of my cokehead uncle, or CHU, for the interest of anonymity, is in town, sober, and wants to thank my dad for his help. He finally shows up around Thanksgiving, and he spends the day with the family. He buys dinner, he puts up a good conversation, does the song, and dance. Sadly, he gives off more red flags instead of putting worries to bed. He goes to the bathroom every 30 minutes, gets caught going into bedrooms, studying every room and what is in it, seeing semi-valuable items, and tries to look while you're distracted. The usual behavior. You may hear this and think, well, maybe he's appreciating the rooms, or he's showing appreciation for your family's things, or maybe he has a bladder infection, and that's why he's in the bathroom all the time. All are reasonable assumptions, but for anyone who knows addict behavior, and yes, I have lived with people that have done this, that's not what's happening. The evening ends without incident, and even though some behavior was highly questionable, nothing is leaving a bad taste in anyone's mouth. Cokehead Uncle says goodbye, but not without mentioning he has a job coming up in a few weeks, and he wants to stop by and say goodbye before he leaves. Time rolls on, and November turns into December, and things are as normal as ever. The year is ending. My dad and uncle talk a couple of times, and it's now Christmas Eve 2018. My uncle was supposed to be leaving for a job early the next day, and he was supposed to come over, but never did. It's no surprise no one heard anything from him, as it was predictable. My dad and brother are packing for the mountains. It's a snowstorm that night, and we were going to head up for some Christmas snowboarding. I leave for work after making plans to meet them on the slopes for the following day. I work, deal with the usual dumb customer questions, clock out 14 hours later, grab dinner, go home. I get back home as the snow begins. The cul-de-sac is quiet, Christmas lights are blinking, and the wind isn't howling. It's a beautiful night. I get inside, go change out of my work clothes, and can begin my 3-day weekend. I make dinner, pop a squat on the couch, and flip on the news. Everything is going smoothly. A nagging feeling begins to creep its way in my consciousness, though. I think it's just the excitement for fresh snow and the small crowd turn out for the day and go back to my meal. The feeling keeps growing and growing as the night goes on, and I start feeling that it isn't anticipation for fresh pow. As if on cue, the back door creeps open. Mike Nelson's weather report is muffled by the sound of fresh snow being crushed under winter boots. I watch as my uncle helps himself inside. No knock at the front door, no ring of the doorbell, not even an awkward moment of shoving his face on the window to look in. Nothing. He walks in, dressed in the latest from B&E Quarterly. Beanie, duffel bag, everything. I failed to mention the back door leads to the dining/living room, and if you aren't looking, you would miss someone sitting on the couch if you aren't looking. Which he wasn't. A solid minute passes, and he hasn't noticed me. My brain is racing for something to say, but all that comes out is, "What are you doing?" He whips his head around and sees me. Fear, shock, and regret explode across his face. If the guy soiled his pants at that moment, it would not have shocked me. He drops the black duffel bag, defeated. Standing there collecting himself, he looks for the right thing to say. Now, I get my dad on the phone, because if my uncle was coming over, he would have said something, which he didn't. My dad picks up and I say, "Hey, Cokehead Uncle just came in through the back door. Is he supposed to be here?" Cokehead Uncle finally finds his words. "Please hang up the phone. I've got nowhere else to go. Please. Please." Dad is livid, screaming about the situation. He then tells me to put him on the speakerphone. Cokehead Uncle gets ripped, the biggest new one I've ever heard. My dad is his older half-brother, and he gets into, "How dare you," and "You should be ashamed," and every other older brother phrase in the book. The situation keeps getting tense, and I tell my uncle he's gotta go. He grabs his stuff, and I'm bigger than he is, and he starts getting ready to leave. We start moving to the exit, trying to keep it non-physical, doing what I can to not make a bad situation worse. My dad is still on the phone, continuing his rant. I get him outside, and the rant subsides. My dad apologizes to me, and tells me he should have never told me he might show up. My brother luckily has called the police, so I don't have to bother Usher and to get police on the phone. I lock up all windows, doors, etc. Cokehead Uncle would have an easier time getting through the Great Wall than getting in again. Cops show up, go through the routine. What happened? Where did he enter? Is anything stolen or broken? Is it alright if it stays inside to wait for his ride to pick him up? Now, my dad wasn't pressing charges, and just wanted Cokehead Uncle gone. So he agreed to have the cops just hold him until we can get a ride to leave. Have that be the end of it, but the last question threw me off a bit. I wanted to be sarcastic, but thankfully chose not to. I told the officer that under no circumstance was I letting Cokehead Uncle back in my house. That seemed to dissatisfy the officer, but I didn't care. My uncle breaks in, and now that he's out, you want me to take him back in and off your hands? That was not gonna happen. He left and wished me a good night, and eventually Cokehead Uncle got picked up and taken to the hotel. The commotion dies down, and I go outside to see what I can find in the snow. Try to give him some faith, and that fresh snow was the most damning evidence of all. I found tracks, my uncle's tracks. They showed everything, and it broke my heart. I could see where he got dropped off and loaded up his stuff, and see how he just beelined for the back door. It was disappointing, and I was just glad he was gone. I finally relax, but I can't sleep. I finally nod off around 1 a.m. and wake up later than expected and head out to meet up with everyone. I get up there, meet up with my dad and brother, and head to the mountain where we were going for the day. We finally get to talking about the night before, and my dad fills in some of the blanks. I'd come to find out that my uncle had called my dad before and was trying to spend the night before leaving the next day. My dad said no. He said that he was going to be up in the mountains and my uncle would have to find somewhere else to go. My uncle said fine, and my dad thought that would be the end of it. How wrong he was. The truth wouldn't be found out until a little later. What then happened after my dad got off the phone with my uncle is this. He told his boss that he has a place he's staying at and needs to be dropped off there for the night, and he can be picked up here the next day, as he had no car and was leaving town the next day. My uncle's boss, not having any knowledge of how the conversation my uncle and dad had, just went along with it. He'd taken my uncle from the job they were on to my dad's house. My uncle expected no one to be home, which is insane. Who does that and thinks it's a good idea? Oh yeah, addicts. Anyway, he betrayed my family's trust and went right back to what he does best. He was not counting on anyone being there at all, and the choice to exploit the cost him a brother. I haven't seen or heard from him in 2 years, and don't want to. I hope that he's doing okay and trying to stay sober. I don't wish him any ill will and hope he can pull himself together. It breaks my heart seeing my family like this, but you can't fix something that doesn't want to get fixed. This story happened to me over 10 years ago when I was a sophomore in high school. First, let me start the story by saying that at this point, the house next door to me had been vacant for almost a year. The elderly woman had passed away, and whomever now owned the house must have never gotten around to doing the necessary repairs to fix it. The old lady who used to live next door to me was a mean and miserable person. She always called the police on the neighbors even though they would barely make any noise or do anything wrong at all. But it was always clear that she did love Christmas. She would hire people to hang up all of the holiday decorations on her front lawn and porch. Well, shortly after Christmas of my freshman year, she passed away due to falling or an accident of nature. Her kids from out of state came and cleaned out the entire house and left it vacant. As previously mentioned, they didn't sell it, repair it, or inhabit it. They just left the house to sit there and essentially rot. After they cleaned out the house, they left the curtains on the side of the house open, and if you looked out of my bedroom window, you could see right into the house. It was semi-creepy, knowing that the house was just so desolate and empty. Well, fast forward now to Christmas Eve of my sophomore year of high school. My brother and I took place in our yearly tradition of watching wrestling DVDs until we got tired. We both decided to go to bed shortly after 2 a.m. on Christmas morning. I shut off all my lights and got into bed and noticed a faint light coming through my blinds. I got up and walked over to my window, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There was a ceiling light on in the house next door. I couldn't explain it. I figured that there was no electricity at all considering the house was vacant and nobody lived there for some time. I stared into the other house in confusion, and then the light shut off. Within 5 seconds or so of the light turned back on again, and that's when I saw it. A brief glimpse of a figure in the doorway of the house. It looked just like the old woman. At this point I knew my mind was playing tricks on me. The lights went off for a second time, and I stood there and stared into the darkness for several minutes, trying to see anything, but it was just pitch blackness. Then a burst of light, and there she was. The old woman was standing right in the window, staring back at me. I fell over in fear and ran into my brother's room. I tried to wake him, but he was out cold. I slept on the floor in his room and stayed up all night trying to compute with what I saw. For years I told my friends this story, and nobody ever believed me. Whenever my friends would stay over, we would always look into the window and try and see something, but we never did. That was over 10 years ago, and that house has since been sold. But since it's been sold, the owners have sold it 3 times after moving in, so I wonder if I'm not the only one who has been seeing the lady wandering the halls. One thing is for sure, that's one Christmas present I'll never forget. This happened 2 years ago, but I always think about it. Every Christmas Eve, we spend the evening at my grandparents' house, where we feast and swap presents with my cousins, all the people we won't be with on Christmas morning. It was a merry and festive evening, and spirits were high, if not a little worn out, on our way home. Pulling into our driveway, we instantly felt something was off. The corner of our house decoration lights were hanging haphazardly free off the roof, and something else we couldn't pinpoint right away. Luckily, the kids were already asleep from soothing dark car ride, so we sat in the driveway, the motor off and ticking as it starts to cool. "Did we leave that many lights on inside?" my husband asked me, because he would never. He's a stickler for turning out lights before we leave. I shook my head no. The Christmas tree was the only thing we left on, but now there was a soft glow from the windows at 2 ends of the house, one being the primary living room area toward the front where we were, and the other the window at the left side of the house, the hallway by our bedroom, and it slightly lit the side yard between our house and the neighbor. We both agreed that it looked like someone had been or was in our house. "Call the cops. Stay in the car with the doors locked." He recranked the car, and I didn't even bother getting out. I just slid over the center console into the driver's seat just in case. He has a concealed carry permit, so he drew his weapon and went to check the front door. It was still locked, so we unlocked it about the time I started telling the police that our house seemed suspicious and we thought someone might be in it. They of course said we should wait outside, but I know there was no use in telling my husband that, as he was already starting inside and flicking on more lights. It was nerve-wracking to sit there and watch the open front door spilling light onto the lawn. I cracked my window just the teeniest bit so I could hear sooner if something started happening. Luckily, nothing did, and when the cops pulled up, I let them know my husband was inside and what he was wearing since he did have his gun out. But all the opening and shutting of the car door alerted him, and woke the kids up so he'd come back to the front door with his gun back under his jacket. I went back to keep the kids busy while he talked to the cops, and then the cops cleared the house. Our visitors were no longer there, but they had broken in through the back door. Many of our Christmas presents were gone, the heaviest ones it seemed, as I'd bought most of them, and they left one of their own, a large pile of shit on the back porch mat. Decorations I had up inside were knocked down and scattered all over the place. The tree was completely disheveled. 2 pieces from my nativity scene were smashed on the floor. Our laptops were gone, and my jewelry box had also been purified. But unknown to them, although some had sentimental meaning, that was all caution or low-value stuff. Anything worth any real value had been hidden in a safe which they hadn't found. My husband made sure not to touch the light switches that had been on, so that the police could collect fingerprints from them and any other evidence could be taken to report for theft. It seems they spent a while inside the house without much fear, brazenly turning on lights, leaving a steamy pile, and maybe as they left, hopping up and tearing the Christmas lights off the corner of the house. No out-of-place fingerprints came back, so they must have been wearing gloves, and it remains unsolved. Next year, they asked for a security system for Christmas.